7:42 a.m. First class is a sanctuary of gold lights and leather. Mark Sullivan, a single dad in a faded work jacket, sits in 2A. A flight attendant leans down. "Sir, you're in the wrong place." Mark's boarding pass is valid, but a passenger scowls. "You don't belong here." Mark stands to leave without resistance. As he turns, his sleeve slides up, revealing a faded seal tattoo. The cockpit door swings open. The captain sees the ink and freezes. He speaks one sentence. The cabin goes silent. Mark Sullivan lived in the quiet, dusty corners of a city that never stopped moving. A man who had mastered the art of being invisible. At 41, his face was a rugged map of hard-won battles. Some fought in foreign deserts under a blood-red moon, where the sand turned to glass under the heat of explosives. Others fought in the sterile, agonizingly bright hallways of cancer wards where the enemy was silent and invisible. He was a single father whose entire universe was anchored by his 8-year-old son, Evan. Since his wife Clara passed away 3 years ago from a sudden, aggressive illness, Mark's life had become a relentless, exhausting cycle of duty and sacrifice. He was a man of few words, preferring the honest weight of action over the hollow metallic ring of speech that filled the air of modern society. By day, he was a ghost in a blue uniform, scrubbing the marble floors of high-rise office buildings before the corporate giants arrived to claim their thrones. He emptied trash bins filled with the discarded dreams and half-eaten lunches of people who never bothered to look him in the eye, treating him as little more than an automated part of the building's maintenance system. He didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, he leaned into it. In the shadows, he could think about the promised future he was building for his son, a future where Evan wouldn't have to disappear to be seen. By night, he sat in a small apartment, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, studying vocational manuals and learning a trade in high-voltage electrical systems. He wanted to give Evan a life where his hands didn't always smell of industrial-grade bleach and floor wax. His hands were calloused and scarred, the skin etched with the labor of a man who refused to break under the crushing weight of grief and poverty. He saved every penny with a discipline that was almost religious, patching his own boots with heavy-duty tape and skipping dinner 3 nights a week so Evan could have new cleats for soccer practice or a warm coat for the winter. He remembered the nights Clara would hold his hands and tell him they were the strongest hands she had ever known. Now, they were just tired. Every dollar saved was a brick in the wall he was building to protect his son from the harshness of the world that had taken so much from them already. This flight, however, was supposed to be a rare moment of respite, a brief intermission in his long-running play of struggle. Mark found himself in first class not through sudden wealth, but through a worker appreciation program that rewarded long-term, invisible employees with donated travel miles. He had accepted the ticket with a stoic nod, thinking only of the extra legroom where he could finally rest his aching lower back, which had been protesting since his last 16-hour double shift. He had never seen such luxury. The soft, buttery leather of the seats and the warm towels scented with lemon felt like a different planet entirely. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood cologne and the rustle of financial newspapers. He sat in seat 2A, his faded work jacket, a relic from his pre-fatherhood days when he wore it to keep the desert chill at bay, looking like a jagged blemish on the pristine leather. He felt the weight of the gazes around him, the sharp, narrow eyes of a businessman in 2B named Julian, who adjusted his gold Rolex as if Mark's presence might devalue the metal on his wrist. Julian looked at Mark as if he were a stain on an otherwise perfect morning. Mark ignored them. He was used to being treated as part of the architecture, a silent witness to the lives of the lucky. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tattered, laminated photo of Evan. The boy was smiling, missing a front tooth, holding a drawing of a superhero in a blue cape. Mark remembered Evan's whispered request that morning. "Bring back a cloud for me, Dad. I want to see if they taste like cotton candy or just cold rain." The lead flight attendant, Sarah, watched Mark from the galley. She saw a man who didn't fit the premium aesthetic of the cabin she worked so hard to maintain. To her, first class was a stage for the elite, and Mark was an uninvited extra who had wandered onto the set by mistake. Encouraged by the impatient sighs and pointed glares of Julian and 2B, She decided to fix the clerical error she assumed must have happened. She approached Mark with a smile that was sharp, artificial, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Sir, there is a minor seating conflict we need to address," she lied, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "Due to a clerical error and a high-priority loyalty member arriving late, we need to relocate you to economy. We'll offer you an extra snack pack and a voucher for a future flight for the inconvenience. Surely you'll be more comfortable among your own peers, where the atmosphere is less formal." Mark looked at her, his eyes calm, dark, and impossibly deep, the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss of human cruelty and didn't blink. He didn't argue. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth the ammunition, and true dignity wasn't something a seat assignment or a silk curtain could take away. He had followed orders in the heat of combat where every second was a heartbeat between life and death, and he could follow this petty instruction now. As he moved to gather his small, worn backpack, the metal latch of the overhead bin caught the fabric of his sleeve. For just a fleeting second, as he pulled his arm away, the sleeve slid up, exposing the dark, intricate ink on his wrist, a mark that represented a life of iron, blood, and shadows. He didn't notice the cockpit door swinging open at that exact moment. He didn't notice the captain, Daniel Reyes, stepping out to perform his final cabin check. The walk toward the back of the plane felt longer than any forced march through the jagged, unforgiving mountains of Tora Bora. Mark kept his gaze fixed on the floor, ignoring the snickers and the hushed, cruel comments that followed him like a bad scent. "Finally, it smells like a regular flight again," Julian in 2B muttered to his colleague, his voice intentionally loud. "I don't pay $5,000 to sit next to the janitorial staff. Quality control is clearly slipping." Mark felt the familiar sting of invisibility, the weight of being judged by the thread count of his jacket rather than the content of his soul, but he carried it with the quiet power of a man who knew exactly who he was. He thought of Evan waiting at home, and the anger dissipated into a weary peace. However, as he maneuvered through the narrow, crowded transition between first class and economy, he bumped into a protruding seat corner. The sudden movement caused his sleeve to slide up even further, revealing the full extent of the tattoo, the jagged, weathered lines of a specialized SEAL trident, accompanied by a unit number that was a ghost in the official Pentagon records. This was the mark of the silent service, given only to those who specialized in the missions the world would never hear about. The men who operated in the black, where no rules applied and no credit was given. Captain Daniel Reyes was a man of the air, but his soul was forged in the fires of the military. He had flown heavy-lift special operations transports into hot zones for a decade before moving to commercial aviation. He was a man who noticed everything. The way the wind shifted against the wings, the subtle vibration of a failing engine, and the precise, unmistakable details of military heraldry. His eyes locked onto Mark's wrist like a heat-seeking missile finding its target. The ink was old, but the meaning was eternal. Daniel froze. The sounds of the cabin, the chatter of the wealthy, the clinking of ice in crystal glasses, the soft humming of the air conditioning, all faded into a dull, white roar. In their place, a violent, visceral memory exploded in his mind like a flashbang. 2009, the Shahikat Valley. The air was thin and tasted of copper. He remembered the smell of burning jet fuel and ozone as his Chinook took fire, the deafening rhythmic roar of an RPG-7 passing inches from his cockpit, the desperate static-filled voice on the radio screaming for an extraction that should have been impossible. He remembered a man covered in a thick layer of gray dust and dried blood, standing alone at a landing zone to provide cover for a crippled helicopter. He remembered the man who waved them off, choosing to stay behind so the wounded could fly, his figure disappearing into a cloud of mortar fire. Sarah, the attendant, noticed the captain's rigid, unmoving posture and assumed he was irritated by the delay. "I've cleared the path, Captain," she said, a note of triumph in her voice, looking for a nod of approval. He was out of place, a mistake from the corporate office. "We're ready for the pre-flight checks and departure now. The VIPs are settled." Daniel didn't look at her. He didn't even acknowledge her existence. His eyes remained fixed on the man in the faded jacket, the man who was now standing at the edge of the curtain, ready to disappear into the anonymity of the back cabin. "Where is that man going?" Daniel asked, his voice low, vibrating with a dangerous intensity, like the rumble of a volcano seconds before an eruption. It was a voice that demanded truth. "To coach, sir," Sarah replied, her professional smile faltering at the captain's tone. "He was a donation seat. We had to accommodate a platinum member who needed the extra space and privacy. It's standard procedure for guest satisfaction." Daniel's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cords. He recognized the unit number beneath the trident. It was Team 9, the very unit that had pulled his broken, bleeding body out of a crashed MH-47 Chinook in a valley filled with enemies. He remembered the man who had promised him he'd see his family again. "Bring him back," Daniel ordered. His voice wasn't a request. It was a combat command that carried the absolute weight of a general's decree. "And don't you dare let him take another step toward that curtain. Not one. If he moves an inch further, this plane stays on the ground." Daniel walked toward Mark, stopping him just as he was about to step into the economy section. The passengers watched, sensing a shift in the air, a conflict they couldn't begin to comprehend. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that made the cabin feel small. "Sir, please," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. "Show me your arm just for a moment. I need to be sure." "I need it." Mark hesitated, his instincts for secrecy, honed by years of classified briefings, warring with the look of desperate hope on the captain's face. He saw the recognition in Daniel's eyes, a shared language of ghosts, fire, and brotherhood that transcended the shallow world of civilian life. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled back the sleeve. The cabin went deathly quiet. The executives, the socialites, and the influencers all stared, their phones midair, sensing that the janitor was something far more than he appeared. The warrior within the father emerged, standing tall, his shoulders squaring as if he were back on the ridge, facing the wind. "I was the pilot of Vulture 1-4, Daniel whispered, tears pricking his eyes as he looked at the man who had been a myth in his mind for over a decade. "You were the one who stayed behind on that ridge. You were the one who held the line when the sky was falling and the mountains were screaming. I saw you disappear into the smoke after the last bird lifted. We spent weeks looking for you. We thought you were a ghost, Mark. I've carried your face in my mind every day since." Daniel turned to the cabin, his voice projecting with a fierce, uncompromising authority that demanded total silence. He looked at Julian in 2B, then at Sarah. "This man is staying in seat 2A. In fact, he is the most important person on this aircraft. He is the reason I am standing here to fly you today. He is the reason many of you are alive to enjoy your wealth. If any of you feel his presence is an inconvenience to your luxury, you are welcome to gather your belongings and exit my plane right now. I will not fly until he is seated where he belongs, and I will not fly until he is treated with the honor he earned in blood." The cabin was paralyzed. Julian, who had just been complaining about the smell of a worker, suddenly found his $5,000 suit feeling very tight and incredibly uncomfortable. He looked at his hands, then at Mark's, and for the first time in his life, felt an overwhelming sense of insignificance. Daniel didn't stop there. He stood at the front of the cabin, eyes blazing with a mixture of fury for the ignorance of the passengers and a deep, soul-shaking reverence for the man in front of him. He rendered a perfect, crisp military salute, a gesture of respect from one survivor to another that silenced every whisper and made the air feel heavy with history. "You were the one who carried me 3 miles through the waist-high brush with shrapnel in my legs and a broken hip while the enemy closed in," Daniel told the stunned passengers, his voice ringing through the cabin like a bell in a storm. He refused the final extraction because the helicopter was overweight and there wasn't enough lift to clear the trees. He stayed behind to cover us, fighting off a battalion with nothing but a rifle, a few mags, and a promise to keep us safe. He is the reason I am alive to see my daughters grow up. He is the reason many of you have the freedom to sit here and complain about the temperature of your steak. You are breathing because he chose to stop breathing for a moment." Mark simply nodded, a humble, tired smile touching his lips. "The war's over for me, Captain. My mission now is being a father. That ridge was a long time ago, and the dust has settled. I'm just a man trying to get home. Daniel turned back to the passengers, determined to strip away the thin, brittle veneer of their arrogance. He explained that Mark Sullivan was once the architect of Team 9, a man so skilled in unconventional warfare, so vital to the safety of the nation, that he had been nominated for the Medal of Honor in a classified ceremony that never appeared in the news. But Mark had turned it down. He didn't want the fame, the parades, or the burden of being a public hero. He wanted peace, and he wanted his family. He told them how, when his wife Clara fell ill, Mark walked away from everything he had built. He walked away from million-dollar private security contracts, from lucrative book deals, and from the prestige of his elite rank. He traded his tactical gear and his night vision goggles for a plastic hospital chair, holding Clara's hand through every grueling, heartbreaking round of chemotherapy. He chose the life of a janitor not because he lacked the intellect or the ambition for more, but because it allowed him to be home every single day when Evan got off the school bus. He wanted to be the one who fixed the scraped knees and listened to the stories of the day. He traded medals for the chance to pack a PB&J sandwich with the crust cut off. He traded the roar of battle for the soft, steady sound of his son's breathing as he tucked him in at night. He is a janitor by choice to care for his son, Daniel barked at the wealthy passengers, his words landing with the weight of heavy artillery. You sit here because you have a high balance in a bank account. He sits here because he has more honor in his scarred knuckles than this entire cabin combined. We owe him our lives, and you owed him your basic human respect. You saw a man in a work jacket and thought you knew his worth. I see the man who held back the dark while you were dreaming of your next promotion. He is the gold standard of what a man should be. The executives who had mocked him now looked at their laps, unable to meet Mark's steady, forgiving gaze. The air in the cabin had shifted irrevocably. The cold, sterile scent of privilege had been replaced by a heavy, newfound, and deeply humbling respect. Sarah, the flight attendant, stood paralyzed in the galley, her face deathly pale. She realized she had tried to move a living legend to the back of the bus because he didn't fit her narrow, scripted definition of success. She felt the weight of her own shallow judgment, and it was crushing. Daniel took the intercom once more, his voice steady now, but filled with a deep, resonant pride that vibrated through the floorboards of the plane. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reyes. Before we begin our journey to Chicago, I want to share something with you. We are carrying a true hero today, a man whose name isn't in the papers, but whose actions have shaped the world we live in. Honor isn't measured by the brand of your watch, the class of your ticket, or the title on your business card. It is measured by what you are willing to sacrifice when no one is watching and there is no reward but your own conscience. Mr. Sullivan spent his life protecting our freedom in the darkest places on earth, and today he deserves the highest respect this airline and this country can offer. We are privileged to have him on board. Sarah, the attendant, approached Mark's seat. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and her voice trembled as she spoke, the artificial smile long gone, replaced by a raw, painful sincerity. I am so sorry, Mr. Sullivan. My behavior was unforgivable. I let my own shallow judgment cloud my duty to every passenger. I treated you like a problem to be solved instead of a human being to be honored. Please allow us to serve you today. Anything you need, anything at all, it is our honor to provide it. You have taught me a lesson I will never forget. Mark looked at her without spite. It's okay, Sarah, he said gently, his voice like worn velvet, calming her nerves. Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Just remember, sometimes the most important person in the room is the one holding the broom, because they're the ones cleaning up the messes the world leaves behind so others can walk on clean floors. Don't look past people. Look at them. Really look at them. Julian, the businessman in 2B, stood up slowly. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the seat cushions. He had spent his life winning, but in this moment, he felt like he had lost everything that mattered. Sir, I would like to offer you my seat if you'd like more room, or perhaps you'd like my meal preference. I am truly, deeply ashamed of what I said. I was a coward hiding behind my status. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Mark shook his head with unshakable dignity. I just want to think about my son, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension with a simple truth. And I'd like to see the clouds from this window. I promised him I'd bring one back, and I intend to keep that promise. The view from here is just fine. Throughout the flight, the atmosphere was transformed. The passengers, once loud, demanding, and self-absorbed, were now quiet and reflective. They watched in a hushed silence as Mark pulled out a drawing from Evan, a picture of a man in a blue cape labeled "My Hero Dad." Daniel personally flew the smoothest takeoff and landing of his 20-year career, a silent, aerial tribute to the warrior in 2A. He checked on Mark every hour, not as a captain to a passenger, but as a brother to a brother, ensuring he had everything he needed, sharing a quiet nod that spoke volumes. The cabin crew, following the captain's lead, treated Mark with a level of care that bordered on reverence, sensing they were in the presence of someone truly exceptional. At sunset, the plane touched down in Chicago, the wheels kissing the tarmac with barely a vibration, as if the aircraft itself was paying its respects. Daniel stood at the cockpit door as the passengers deplaned, a sentry at the gate of honor. He refused to let anyone leave the aircraft until Mark Sullivan was ready to gather his things. As Mark walked toward the exit, carrying his worn backpack that had seen more of the world than most of the people in the cabin, Daniel stood at attention and saluted him one last time, a tear finally escaping and rolling down his weathered cheek. "Thank you for coming home, Mark," Daniel said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcends the uniform and the years. "If you ever need anything, a job, a favor, a brother to talk to at 3 a.m. when the shadows get too long, you have my personal number. It's in your pocket. Don't live in the shadows anymore. You've done your time in the dark for all of us, and it's time you walked in the light." "Anno," Mark paused, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face, softening the hard lines of his jaw and making him look years younger for a brief second. "I haven't left the fight, Daniel," he said softly, leaning in so only the captain could hear the truth of his soul. "I just changed battlefields. My greatest victories don't happen on ridges or in valleys anymore. They don't involve rifles or extraction points. They happen in a small kitchen over third-grade math homework and a bowl of cereal. And for me, that's more than enough. That's everything I ever fought for." Mark disappeared into the bustling, anonymous airport crowd, his faded jacket blending in once again with the thousands of travelers who were too busy to notice the hero in their midst. He found a quiet corner near the baggage claim, away from the noise, and answered a video call from Evan. The boy's face lit up the screen, his eyes wide with an excitement that made the entire grueling trip worth it. "Did you bring a cloud, Dad? Did you catch a big one for me?" "I built a jar for it," Evan asked, his voice full of pure, unfiltered hope. Mark looked out the large glass windows at the darkening Chicago sky, at the soft, white wisps of clouds illuminated by the city lights like diamonds in the dark. "I'm bringing the whole sky home to you, buddy," Mark replied, his heart fuller than it had been since the day Clara passed away. The joy in his son's voice provided a satisfaction that no medal, no rank, and no first-class seat could ever dream of providing. It was the only reward that mattered. The passengers from the flight watched him go from a distance, a giant in a janitor's uniform, a king in a faded jacket. They finally realized the lesson Mark had lived every day. First class wasn't a seat you bought with a black card, inherited through status, or claimed through a title. It was the character you lived when you thought no one was looking and the world had forgotten your name. They had tried to push him aside, but in doing so, they had only revealed the immense, unyielding shadow of a true hero who chose love over glory every single day. If you believe a father's sacrifice is the ultimate act of bravery, leave a respect in the comments and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We honor the silent guardians who protect our families and our country, one quiet victory at a time.